Today we celebrate the Epiphany of the Lord. This festival is usually celebrated on January 6th, but several churches move it to the Sunday after the celebration of the Holy Family. On this occasion, the Gospel is taken from Matthew 2, 1 to 12. When Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of King Herod, behold, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star at its rising and have come to do him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was greatly troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Assembling all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They said to him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it has been written through the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, since from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and ascertained from them the time of the star's appearance. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search diligently for the child. When you have found him, bring me word, that I too may go and do him homage." After their audience with the king, they set out. And behold, the star that they had seen at its rising preceded them, until it came and stopped over the place where the child was. They were overjoyed at seeing the star, and on entering the house they saw the child with Mary his mother. They prostrated themselves and did him homage. Then they opened their treasures and offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed for their country by another way. Epiphany means to manifest, to show oneself, or to make oneself known. And what we celebrate is that Jesus makes himself known to the world, and that Christians around the world recognize him as God and Lord. It is a very old festival, even older than Christmas itself. As you know, the date of Christmas was chosen in the 4th century as the day to celebrate the birth of Jesus, because it falls during the winter solstice in the northern hemisphere. The solstice being the date when the days stop getting shorter, and from that moment on, they start getting longer. Traditionally, the solstice had been a peasant festival where the birth of the sun, the birth of light, is celebrated. And the Church affirms that the true sun, the true light that is born, is Jesus. However, the winter solstice only makes itself felt a few days later, and it could be said that on January 6th, it is already evident, widely known, and manifest that the Son has been born. That's the reason why there are some peasant festivals that celebrate the obvious birth of the Son around January 6th. And just as it is with the birth of the Son, so it is with the birth of Jesus. Christmas is the celebration of the birth of Jesus, but his coming would only become visible and evident a few days later. This is why, on January 6th, the day of the festival that the Church calls Epiphany, or Feast of the Manifestation, we celebrate Jesus revealing himself and making himself known to all. And that is also the day that the Holy Family presented its Son to the world. That said, let's see what today's Gospel teaches us. First of all, Matthew says that the Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem. More than magicians, they were wise men, as enlightened people who understand actually realize. By the time Matthew wrote his Gospel, towards the end of the 1st century, the Church had already spread to several non-Jewish countries. And these wise men from the East represent those Christians from distant towns who, unlike the Jews, already recognized Jesus as the Messiah. Upon arriving in Jerusalem, these characters asked, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star at its rising and have come to do him homage. The Gospel emphasizes that the Messiah would come accompanied by light from his star. Obviously, this is not a cosmic event, but refers to a symbolic star that alludes to the light that the Messiah brings, a light that will wake up the people and that will illuminate all men who come into this world. The text emphasizes the light of the star because it signals the presence of the Messiah. It is his light which allows us to see and realize that indeed he has arrived. These foreigners also remind Jews of their ancient held beliefs, and they told them something like, "The Messiah you were waiting for has arrived, because we saw his star at its rising." That is, we have seen the signs that accompany it. We have recognized it, and that is why we come to worship it. In other words, they said, "How can you not realize that the true King of the Jews has arrived and is already in our midst?" Matthew then tells us about the inconvenience that his arrival caused in those who did not want his coming. Of course, they didn't want his coming because he came to obtain justice for everyone, which meant they would lose the powers and privileges they had. Privileges that had been misused and that had generated pain and injustice among the people. For example, we have Herod, a cruel and bloodthirsty king, who was startled by the news and began to try to find out where this threat was to be born. His advisors told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it has been written through the prophet." And they also reminded him that he is to shepherd my people, Israel. That is, he would become the true shepherd, the one who would take care of his sheep and would not abuse them. So faced with the danger of losing his privileges and his power, Herod called the Magi secretly and ascertained from them the time of the star's appearance. Here Matthew slightly ridicules Herod, who despite all his power, seemed to fear a newborn child. And with every intention of deceiving them, for this is how evil works, Herod dismissed the foreign wise men, telling them, "When you have found him, bring me word, that I too may go and pay him homage." In this part of the text, Matthew wants us to realize the extreme discomfort that evil feels in the presence of God, and shows us that he did everything possible, with deception and lies, to oppose him. And by way of contrast, Matthew emphasizes the innocence, naivety, and lack of malice of those who honestly seek good and trust in God. Once the wise men had departed, Matthew places us again before the light of God by saying, "And behold, the star that they had seen at its rising preceded them until it came and stopped over the place where the child was." Since God will always guide those who trust in him to the light. And they were overjoyed at seeing the star, that is, seeing that Jesus meets the conditions expected of the Messiah. It is the joyful satisfaction of those who see that God's promises are always fulfilled. Finally, after this introduction, God manifests himself, shows himself, and reveals himself to all peoples. The text goes on to say, "And on entering the house they saw the child with Mary, his mother. They prostrated themselves and did him homage." This act of worship indicates the awareness that the church already had about the divinity of Jesus in the time of Matthew. For Matthew and his church, Jesus clearly was God and Lord. And this becomes evident in the gifts that the wise men gave to the child. Then they opened their treasures and offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. These gifts reveal to us the degree of reflection that the community of Matthew had reached, a church that already at that time was made up mostly of non-Jews. Well, through these symbolic gifts, the church recognizes, first, that Jesus is King, and for that the gold. Second, that Jesus is God, sacred and divine, and for that the incense. And lastly, they also gift him myrrh. Myrrh is a bitter-tasting resin that was used for perfumery and medicinal ointments, but also to prepare the dead, embalm them. And mixed with wine, it was used to alleviate the pain of the crucified. It might be thought that they brought him myrrh as a perfume, but since the text is largely theological, its bitter taste and its allusion to the cross and death could very well symbolize the difficult path of Jesus. From the beginning, the Church recognized that the path back to the Father, the one proposed by Jesus, is the difficult path of sacrifice and of giving one's life for others. Matthew ends his story by telling us that the Magi, having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, departed for their country by another way. For God will always deliver the good from difficulties. And if we recognize Jesus as the Messiah and accept the path of good, God will accompany us on our journey and protect us from all evil. In conclusion, the Gospel has presented Jesus as King and as God. And we have been invited to consider that this newborn child, lying in a simple manger, is in fact the King of the universe and the Creator of all that exists. And he has done it through a disconcerting scene where omnipotence meets fragility, greatness meets smallness, eternity meets transience, strength meets weakness, in which God, eternal, omnipotent, and immortal, manifests himself to us in the fragile figure of a dependent child, just a few days old. But why does the Gospel show God in this way? To teach us that God's ways are not our ways, that his way of seeing life is different from ours, that his way of proceeding is not our way of proceeding, and that his scale of values is different from that of the world. Well, while the world seeks power and strength, he instead chooses weakness and sacrifice. And so we realize and fully recognize that only the path that Jesus suggests to us, that of giving our lives for others, will bring us closer to him. Let us ask God for his grace to discover him in what the world discards and find him in what the world does not value. And in this way, his light will illuminate our lives. Society of Jesus, Jesuits, Peru.